Justice in Chains, the day a killer saved another man's life, the fire inside. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a reckoning inside the walls of America's most dangerous prison. The air inside the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in 1994 was thick with tension, as if the concrete itself could sense the explosion coming. For weeks, rumors had spread like wildfire, whispers of retaliation, of rival gangs planning something big. And then, on April 11th, the walls of the prison finally erupted. It started in L Block, the most volatile section, filled with men who had nothing left to lose. Guards were overpowered, makeshift weapons appeared out of nowhere, and the power was cut. What followed was a living nightmare. Smoke curled through the hallways, screams echoed off the steel bars, and every inmate suddenly became part of a war they didn't choose. Among the chaos was Keith LaMar, a death row inmate convicted of a robbery gone wrong. To the state, he was a murderer. To his fellow prisoners, he was quiet, detached, the kind of man who kept his head down and his words few. But that night, the walls that separated good from evil began to blur. In the middle of the riot, as fires raged and prisoners took over the cell blocks, a small group of inmates were dragged into the open by a gang seeking revenge. They accused them of being informants, snitches who'd sold out their own. One of the men was terrified, trembling, his hands bound with a ripped bedsheet. His name was Rodney, a low-level offender who'd been trying to keep his head down until his release date. But in the madness there were no release dates, only survival. Keith saw Rodney being cornered near the old shower block, surrounded by men with sharpened metal rods. The air was filled with shouting, threats, curses, pure fury. Keith could have walked away. No one would have blamed him. He wasn't a hero, and no one in this place expected heroes. But something inside him refused to move. He stepped forward. "What's he done?" Keith shouted over the noise. The men turned, their eyes wild. "He's a snitch. He sold us out to the COs." Rodney was shaking his head frantically, crying that it wasn't true. And Keith, for a moment, saw himself. Years ago, cornered, accused, and desperate to prove a truth no one believed. "Let him go," Keith said. Laughter followed. "You trying to play savior now, LaMar? He's dead." But Keith didn't back down. He stood there, defiant, as flames flickered from a burning mattress nearby. His voice was low but sharp as glass. "If you touch him, you'll have to go through me first." For a second, everything froze. Even in a riot, even in chaos, there are rules, and no one wanted to challenge a man like LaMar when his eyes burned like that. Slowly, the gang backed off, muttering curses as they disappeared down the hall. Rodney slumped to the floor, gasping for breath. Keith helped him up and led him to a storage room, barricading the door. Outside, the prison continued to burn. Inside, two men, one sentenced to die, one praying to live, sat in silence, their faces lit by the faint orange glow of distant fire. "Why'd you do that?" Rodney finally whispered. Keith didn't answer. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe, for once, doing something right didn't need a reason. Hours later, when the guards finally regained partial control of the block, they found Keith and Rodney alive. But in the chaos that followed, as investigations began and bodies were counted, Keith's act of defiance didn't fade. It grew. Whispers spread through the prison. A killer who'd saved a man from certain death. Some called it redemption. Others called it insanity. But for Keith LaMar it was neither. It was justice in chains. A moment when humanity flickered in a place built to extinguish it. And when investigators started piecing together what happened that night, they realized something terrifying. Not all the killings were random. Some were executions, planned, targeted, and precise. And somehow, Keith's name kept appearing in the middle of it all. The blood ledger. When the smoke cleared and the screams faded into silence, the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility looked like a war zone. Walls were scorched, steel bars were twisted, and the stench of burnt cloth and blood hung heavy in the air. 4 days, officers and investigators picked through the wreckage, counting the dead. 9 inmates were found brutally murdered. Every single one had been targeted, their deaths too deliberate to be called chaos. And among the survivors, one name kept surfacing in whispered conversations: Keith LaMar. At first, investigators didn't believe it. LaMar wasn't known as a gang enforcer or instigator. He'd always been quiet, observant, the kind of inmate who avoided drama. But when prison intelligence began reconstructing the riot's timeline, something stood out. Every time a key killing happened, LaMar had been nearby. The prison administration was desperate for someone to blame. The governor was on television demanding answers, the public was furious, and the media was already calling it the Lucasville massacre. The warden knew what this meant: heads would roll and someone had to pay. So the investigators began to press the survivors. In a dimly lit interrogation room, Rodney sat across from Detective Harris, still shaken from the riot. His hands trembled as he spoke. "You don't get it," he whispered. "Keith saved my life. He didn't kill anyone." But Harris leaned in, his voice cold. "You're saying he wasn't involved? Because we've got other inmates telling a different story." Rodney froze. He'd heard the rumors, inmates being offered plea deals or protection in exchange for naming names. Inside these walls, truth didn't matter as much as survival. And survival meant silence, or sacrifice. Meanwhile, Keith sat alone in his cell, his body bruised, his eyes hollow. From his window he could see the aftermath: scorched mattresses, shattered glass, guards in riot armor patrolling like ghosts. He knew what was coming. He'd lived long enough in the system to recognize the machinery of blame when it started turning. 2 days later he was pulled from his cell and brought to the same interrogation room. The room was cold, with a single flickering light. Detective Harris tossed a file on the table. Photos spilled out, faces of the dead, bloodied and lifeless. "You were seen near 3 of these murders. You want to tell me why?" Keith stared at the photos without flinching. "Because I was trying to stop more of them." Harris smirked. "That's a noble line, LaMar. But nobody's buying it." Keith leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "You want a killer? Look higher. Look at the deals you made before this riot started. The gangs knew everything. Someone let it happen." The detective's expression hardened. "You're saying this was inside help?" Keith didn't answer. "You didn't have to. Because in prisons like Lucasville, everyone knew power didn't just come from muscle. It came from information, and someone had been feeding both sides." Weeks passed. Investigations turned into trials. And when the indictments finally came down, Keith LaMar's name was at the top of the list. He was accused of leading a death squad during the riot, organizing killings, silencing informants and enforcing gang orders. Rodney tried to testify in his defense, but his statement mysteriously disappeared before the hearing. The prosecution's case was airtight, too airtight. Multiple inmates suddenly remembered Keith's role. Witnesses who'd been in other cell blocks somehow gave detailed accounts of murders they couldn't have seen. Keith sat through it all in silence. The courtroom buzzed with reporters, families of victims, and officers demanding justice. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man sentenced to death once, now being condemned again for crimes he didn't commit. But in a system that needed a villain, Keith LaMar fit perfectly. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. The verdict: guilty on all counts. Sentenced to death by lethal injection. As the guards escorted him out of the courtroom, a reporter shouted, "Keith, do you have anything to say to the families of the victims?" He paused, looked straight into the cameras and said softly, "Tell them I didn't kill their sons. I saved one, and I'd do it again." The courtroom went silent. For a brief moment, even the judge's gavel didn't move. But outside those walls, headlines were already printing. Riot ringleaders sentenced to death. LaMar, the monster of Lucasville. What no one knew, not the press, not the prosecution, not even the warden, was that a hidden ledger existed. A coded notebook passed between inmates during the riot. A record of who gave orders, who killed, and who was paid off. And in that ledger, one name was circled in red. Not Keith LaMar's. Someone else's. The name in red. The death row block was silent at night, too silent. The kind of silence that felt staged, as if the entire building were holding its breath. Keith LaMar lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the fluorescent light above him echoing like a timer counting down his days. He'd been on death row for months now. The days blurred together, breakfast, yard time, lights out. But something in him hadn't gone quiet. The same instinct that made him step between Rodney and death during the riot kept burning inside him. He knew there was more, something buried beneath layers of lies and paperwork. Then one evening, as the guards performed their rounds, a folded note slid under his cell door. No name. No signature. Just a single line written in pencil. "The ledger is still inside." Keith sat up instantly. He knew what it meant: the small notebook inmates had passed around during the chaos. A record of killings, debts, and payoffs. He'd seen it once, briefly, before it vanished in the firestorm of the riot. But now, someone was telling him it survived. 2 days later he got confirmation. During laundry duty, another inmate, Benny, a wiry man who'd been part of the cleaning crew after the riot, whispered without looking at him. "It's real. Hidden in the vent behind C-block laundry room. You didn't hear it from me." That night, Keith couldn't sleep. The thought kept circling his mind: that ledger could prove everything. It could clear his name. But more than that, it could reveal who orchestrated the massacre, who turned a prison into a slaughterhouse. He wrote a letter to a journalist who'd once covered his case, a woman named Lydia Crane. She had written about the inconsistencies in his trial: missing testimony, coerced witnesses, destroyed evidence. If anyone could bring the truth to light, it was her. Weeks later she arrived. Separated by thick glass, she looked at him with cautious curiosity. "They told me you wanted to talk about new evidence," she said. Keith nodded. "Not evidence, truth. There's a ledger. It's hidden. It has the names of everyone who gave the orders during the riot. Even the guards who helped." Lydia's eyes widened. "You're saying correctional officers were involved?" Keith leaned closer. "Not all of them. But enough to make it work. They let it happen, to settle scores, to silence snitches. And they needed someone to take the fall." She promised to look into it. But in places like Lucasville, promises were dangerous currency. 3 nights later, the prison went into lockdown. An anonymous tip claimed contraband had been discovered near the laundry vent. Guards tore the place apart, searching every inch, but the ledger was gone. Someone had beaten them to it. Then Lydia vanished. Her editors said she took a sudden leave of absence. Her phone disconnected. And the only clue she left behind was an envelope mailed from a small town 3 hours from the prison. Inside it, a single torn page from a notebook. The handwriting matched Keith's memory. Next to each listed death was a coded name, and next to the final name, written in thick red ink, were 2 words: Warden's Order. When the prison administration learned that a journalist had been investigating the riot again, Keith's privileges were revoked. No more visits. No more mail. It was clear: someone powerful was cleaning up loose ends. But Keith wasn't finished. With the help of Benny and a few old allies, he began documenting everything: every conversation, every unexplained lockdown, every retaliatory beating. He sent the pages out one at a time through legal mail, addressed to Lydia's editor, each marked Lucasville Truth. Months passed before the story finally broke. A front-page exposé titled, "The Ledger of Lucasville: What the State Tried to Bury." It hit like a bomb. The article detailed corruption, collusion, and cover-ups. Several guards were implicated in orchestrating the riot to control gang power inside the prison. And most chilling of all, testimony that the warden himself had approved certain killings to reassert control through fear. But justice in systems built on secrecy comes slow. Keith's execution date was set for the following year. Appeals were filed, delayed, denied. Yet letters began pouring in, from students, lawyers, even former guards, all calling for his sentence to be reviewed. On the night before his scheduled execution, Keith wrote his final note. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a plea. Just one line: "I saved one life in the riot, and now maybe a few more with the truth." When they came for him in the morning, he didn't resist. The guards walked him down the long corridor, the echo of their boots hollow against the concrete. Outside, news cameras gathered. Inside, the warden stood watching, silent, pale, his name whispered now in the same breath as the ledger. As Keith took his final breath, a line from Lydia's article replayed in his mind. "Even among killers there can be justice. Sometimes the man in chains is the only one telling the truth." And in that moment, the prison, the same place that had swallowed lives and blood and lies, felt, for the first time, utterly silent. If you think this story was intense, wait until you hear what happened when another inmate tried to expose the truth from the same prison. Hit subscribe, you won't believe what came next.